They lied. All of them. 21 top officials in Burkina Faso. Caught with fake diplomas. Exposed for stealing not just certificates, but the future of millions. September 4th, 2025. A date etched in the nation's memory. A day when trust was ripped open in full view of the world. Cameras flashed. Citizens gasped. And at the center stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, delivering a revelation that shattered the very foundation of government. This was no minor scandal. These were directors, financial managers, senior advisors, people who had steered budgets, hospitals, schools, and infrastructure projects with credentials that never existed. The betrayal was breathtaking. Every forged paper represented stolen opportunity, wasted resources, and broken faith. Economists warned of hundreds of millions lost, but the cost went far beyond numbers. Entire careers, the hope of honest students, and the dignity of the state itself had been stolen. And yet, in the chaos, a spark flickered, a whisper of something impossible. Could integrity survive? Could a nation rise from the ashes of deceit? Across Ouagadougou, Lagos, and Johannesburg, young Africans held their breath. Leadership, it seemed, was no longer a title to buy. It was a responsibility to earn, and the question now loomed: would Africa finally demand the truth? The announcement had been merciless. Captain Traoré read the names aloud, each syllable striking like a gavel. Offices emptied within hours. Luxury cars, hidden bank accounts, and lavish properties were seized. Citizens watched in stunned silence, realizing the betrayal ran deeper than anyone had imagined. These were not rogue clerks. They were the architects of policy, the gatekeepers of opportunity, the very hands shaping Burkina Faso's future. And they were unqualified. Families of diligent students, long denied jobs, despite years of study, whispered in relief and disbelief. Finally, murmured a young graduate in Bobo Dioulasso. Finally, someone is counting merit, not connections. Yet relief was tinged with anger. How many futures had been stolen? How many roads remained incomplete? How many hospitals mismanaged? Captain Traoré knew the cost was more than economic. It was moral, social, and generational. Behind the cameras, behind the speeches, a storm of internal pressure brewed. Military advisors, civil servants, and political allies whispered about the risks. Regional backlash, international scrutiny, threats from entrenched elites. But Traoré's eyes did not waver. He had chosen transparency, choosing the long road over the easy silence. Integrity, he seemed to say, would not be optional. Not anymore. And the shockwaves traveled fast. Across the nation, ordinary citizens debated, protested, and celebrated in equal measure. Social media erupted. Hashtags calling for no more fake diplomas trended. Students burned mock certificates in public squares. Across West Africa, peers in Ghana, Nigeria, Benin, and Togo watched closely, wondering if this purge was merely local theater or the first domino in a continental reckoning. Even in the heart of government, murmurs of fear spread. Could other ministries withstand scrutiny? How many officials in neighboring countries had quietly purchased their titles? Captain Traoré knew this was only the beginning. Removing 21 officials was symbolic, a shock to awaken the nation. The real battle would be to rebuild trust, restore meritocracy, and ensure that competence, not deception, governed the nation's destiny. The young, in particular, felt a surge of possibility. For decades, the narrative had been clear. Connections mattered more than knowledge, money more than diligence. Now, for the first time, a different message emerged. One that whispered to every graduate who had been overlooked: your effort counts. Your education matters. Your integrity can shape the future. But as the sun set over Ouagadougou that September evening, the lingering question remained, and it would not be easily answered. Could one man, one government, ignite a change powerful enough to reach every corner of a continent long scarred by corruption and compromise? Or would the old networks, the invisible markets of deceit, simply adapt, waiting for the next opportunity to reclaim what had been exposed? Captain Traoré's voice echoed in the hearts of the people. Leadership is not a privilege to purchase, but a responsibility to earn. And with that, a nation, and perhaps a continent, was left to wonder who will step forward when truth is finally non-negotiable. The purge had begun. The spark was lit, and the story of Burkina Faso, its failures, its courage, and its fight for dignity was just starting to unfold. The shock of September 4th did not fade with the evening news. For ordinary citizens, it rippled through every facet of life. Families who had sacrificed, studied, and waited for opportunity now realized that the doors had been closed not by merit, but by deceit. Children watched their parents shake their heads, whispering words they barely understood. Betrayal, corruption, incompetence. Captain Ibrahim Traoré understood the magnitude of the failure. This was not a simple administrative oversight. The 21 officials represented the very core of governance, the hands that approved budgets, built schools, managed hospitals, and negotiated infrastructure contracts. Policies that affected millions had been signed with pens, guided by lies. Roads were delayed. Health services faltered. Educational programs collapsed under mismanagement. And the citizens were paying the hidden cost. Economists and analysts quickly began to quantify what had been stolen. Reports suggested that mismanaged projects and inflated budgets could have drained the nation hundreds of millions of US dollars each year. But the true cost could not be measured in numbers alone. Entire careers were displaced. Young graduates, discouraged. Women and rural students pushed further into marginalization. Every forged diploma represented a stolen chance, a blocked path, a betrayal of hope. In the ministries, the atmosphere was tense, almost electric. Officials whispered behind closed doors, unsure who could be trusted. Some wondered if their own colleagues were next. Civil servants who had labored for years, earning every promotion through diligence and skill, now questioned the very system they served. And yet, there was also a spark of cautious hope. The purge had proven that accountability was possible, that deceit was no longer untouchable. Across West Africa, the revelation sparked conversations that crossed borders. Ghanaian universities debated whether their accreditation system could be vulnerable. Nigerian policymakers questioned the credentials of senior civil servants. In towns and cities far from Ouagadougou, young Africans asked themselves for the first time, if one country could confront deceit so openly, why not ours? The scandal had become more than a local drama. It was a continental mirror, reflecting a deeper malaise. Captain Traoré did not allow the moment to be merely symbolic. He knew that exposing these officials was only the first step. The public release of names, the freezing of assets, and the swift dismissals were all statements. Transparency was no longer negotiable. Every citizen watching, from street vendors to university professors, understood that the old rules had changed. Yet the challenge ahead loomed large: how to rebuild the very institutions that had been compromised for decades. At the heart of the matter lay a question that kept Traoré awake at night. How many more hidden networks of deceit existed? Could this be limited to the 21 officials? Or was it the tip of an iceberg? Evidence from preliminary investigations hinted at a regional network. A shadow economy of fake diplomas, phantom degrees, and ghost employees. The implications were staggering. If left unchecked, this corruption could undermine West Africa itself, eroding trust, wasting resources, and strangling potential for generations. The human toll was just as urgent. Teachers whose qualifications had been genuine watched positions filled by imposters. Doctors who had labored through medical school found themselves sidelined, while untrained managers oversaw hospital budgets. Engineers with years of field experience saw contracts handed to individuals whose knowledge existed only on paper. The betrayal was personal, intimate, and profound. Citizens were not simply angry, they were wounded. And yet, within the anger, a new sense of purpose emerged. Students and young professionals who had felt powerless began to see possibility. Integrity was not a distant ideal. It was actionable. The message was clear. Positions earned through deception could be exposed, challenged, and reclaimed. Leadership required responsibility, not purchase. Merit mattered again. But as the country processed the shock, the lurking question grew darker. If deception had reached this depth within Burkina Faso, how extensive was it beyond the borders? Was this scandal merely a national aberration, or the first crack in a regional edifice of corruption built on forged credentials. Analysts warned that similar networks across neighboring countries could have quietly influenced budgets, polícies, and infrastructure projects affecting millions more. Captain Traoré's response was decisive. Investigators were deployed, auditing every major ministry, every senior appointment, every project overseen by questionable hands. Transparency became the clarion call. For the first time, the government operated in full view of the citizens it served. Yet even as confidence slowly began to rebuild, the nation and its neighbors could not ignore the looming shadow. The betrayal had been enormous, but so was the opportunity. If trust could be restored, if competence and merit became the currency of governance, then a new model of leadership could emerge, one that West Africa had never seen before. The question now hung in the air, heavy and urgent. Could the purge of 21 officials ignite systemic change? Or would it be a fleeting blaze? Smothered by entrenched networks and political expediency, the answer would not come easily. For every citizen demanding accountability, there were hidden interests, ready to resist. For every student inspired by integrity, there was an old guard clinging to privilege. The battle had begun, and the first sparks had lit the path, but the horizon remained uncertain. And the stakes, the very future of governance in Burkina Faso and beyond, had never been higher. If 21 officials could wield deception to shape a nation, what unseen networks lurk beyond the spotlight? And how many more futures have already been stolen? Burkina Faso's purge was only the first crack. Investigators quickly realized that the problem did not end at national borders. Across West Africa, a hidden ecosystem of deception had thrived for decades, a shadow network where diplomas could be purchased as easily as bread at the market. Ghana, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, all had their share of so-called universities that existed only on paper, factories of fraud where ambition could be bought. These were not secret whispers anymore. Reports surfaced of more than 200 institutions designed solely to issue counterfeit credentials. Websites mimicked legitimate universities with polished logos, fabricated accreditation seals, and convincing online verification portals. Even careful employers struggled to separate truth from forgery. For some, a single forged degree could unlock not just a government job, but influence over millions in policy and budgets. The numbers were staggering. Analysts estimated nearly 500,000 fake diplomas circulated in West African governments, banks, energy firms, hospitals, and schools. Each certificate was not just a lie, it was a ticking time bomb. Bridges signed off by untrained engineers, hospitals managed by uncertified directors, budgets controlled by managers who had never studied finance. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. For Captain Traoré, the scale of the problem was terrifying. His purge of 21 officials had revealed only the surface. The investigation suggested a regional network of brokers, middlemen, and insiders colluding across borders. Certificates were imported, notarized, stamped with names of distant institutions, and sold with entire career paths attached. Each sale eroded the meritocracy that nations depended on for development. Inside Burkina Faso, civil servants began to speak quietly about what they had long suspected. Their neighbors had also been touched by these networks. Some ministers confessed to turning a blind eye, fearing political backlash or reprisal. Others admitted taking shortcuts themselves to secure positions or promotions. The truth was unavoidable. This was systemic, and it extended far beyond the borders of any single state. Economists calculated that the annual drain from unqualified appointments could reach billions across West Africa. But the human cost was just as severe. Students who had earned degrees honestly saw positions filled by imposters. Women and rural students, already disadvantaged, were disproportionately excluded. Communities lost doctors, engineers, and teachers. Human capital quietly sabotaged by an invisible market. Governments in neighboring countries watched anxiously as news from Burkina Faso spread. In Nigeria, the Ministry of Education faced pressure to audit tens of thousands of civil service files. Ghana, long regarded as a leader in higher education, admitted that diploma mills were damaging its international reputation. Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal saw resignations of municipal leaders exposed by investigative journalists. Sometimes, before official probes could even begin. Meanwhile, the brokers behind these networks operated with sophistication. Insiders within legitimate universities were bribed to enter fraudulent names into registries, giving the appearance of legitimacy. International links further complicated verification. Foreign certificates were imported, with forged stamps and signatures that few could authenticate. The system had been designed to deceive, and it worked until Captain Traoré drew attention to it. The public response was electric. Across West Africa, students, graduates, and young professionals debated, protested, and demanded reform. Social media campaigns called for accountability, using hashtags like #NoFakeDiplomas and African Excellence. Videos of students burning fake certificates went viral, inspiring debates in classrooms and town halls. Young Africans who had long felt powerless now felt a spark of hope. If Burkina Faso could confront its own corruption so openly, why could their nations not do the same? Yet for every surge of hope, there was resistance. Political elites whispered about potential destabilization, warning that mass reforms could topple fragile bureaucracies. Some feared that exposing networks regionally could provoke backlash, both domestically and internationally, and hidden in the shadows, the brokers and their allies began to move, preparing to adapt to this new scrutiny, to exploit any gaps left by reformers. Captain Traoré's team worked tirelessly to trace connections. Cross-border audits, intelligence sharing, and public reporting became the order of the day. For the first time, citizens could see that governance was not a private game of influence and money. Accountability was emerging not just as an ideal, but as a tangible force. The spark in Burkina Faso threatened to ignite a continental movement, if it could withstand the entrenched interests ready to resist. If 500,000 fake diplomas already circulate across West Africa, and shadow networks adapt faster than reformers, who will stop the next wave of deception, and how many futures are still at risk before integrity truly takes hold? The morning after the purge, Burkina Faso's ministries resembled storm-battered islands. Offices sat empty, files scattered, and whispers filled the hallways. Directors who had built careers on deception were gone, leaving their teams bewildered and cautious. Policies signed by unqualified hands were suddenly under scrutiny, and every civil servant knew that no corner of government would remain untouched. In the Ministry of Finance, accountants pored over budgets, realizing that millions had been misallocated under the guidance of untrained managers. Hospitals discovered discrepancies in procurement. Contracts that were supposed to supply vital medical equipment had been handled by administrators who could barely read a balance sheet. Schools and universities scrambled to verify records, uncovering more fake credentials among education officers than anyone had anticipated. Every ministry, from infrastructure to health, from education to agriculture, felt the tremor. Citizens felt it too. In the streets of Ouagadougou, markets buzzed with conversation about stolen opportunities. Mothers worried whether their children would receive quality education. Patients questioned whether hospitals could be trusted. Farmers wondered whether new irrigation projects would ever materialize. The betrayal was systemic, and the fallout was immediate. It was no longer a story confined to headlines. It touched the daily lives of millions. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's office became a hub of crisis management. Teams of auditors and investigators were deployed to each ministry, cross-referencing every project, contract, and appointment. Public briefings explained the scope of errors. While assets of dismissed officials were frozen, the nation watched closely, absorbing each revelation. Luxury vehicles, expensive properties, and hidden bank accounts tied to officials whose qualifications were fraudulent. The government was no longer silent. Accountability was now visible, undeniable. But the scale of the problem was intimidating. Policies signed by these unqualified hands had guided budgets worth hundreds of millions. Infrastructure projects stalled for years. Hospitals overbooked or under-equipped. Educational programs mismanaged. Analysts estimated that services affecting over 6 million citizens had suffered from incompetence. Every mismanaged file, every delayed contract, every failed project was a reminder that fraud at the top rippled outward, affecting ordinary lives in ways both subtle and catastrophic. In ministries where honest civil servants had labored for years, Morale was mixed. Relief at the dismissal of imposters mingled with anxiety. If 21 officials had been removed, who else was hiding credentials? Teams questioned every colleague, every appointment, every previous approval. Trust, once broken, was not easily restored. Yet this environment of accountability was new, unfamiliar, and strangely invigorating. For some, it offered a chance to reclaim integrity. For others, it was a warning. Complacency was no longer safe. Outside the bureaucracy, citizens debated what they had witnessed. Young graduates, long frustrated by systemic inequality, spoke openly about the opportunities that had been stolen. Women and students from rural communities recognized the significance of this purge. It was a signal that merit, hard work, and honesty might finally be rewarded. Social media amplified these discussions, turning outrage into dialogue into civic pressure. Burkina Faso was awakening, its people both alarmed and inspired. Yet even as the nation processed this internal shock, the shadow of doubt remained. Could the ministries recover? Could they deliver services effectively with a wave of inexperienced replacements? Captain Traoré mitigated this by promoting verified young professionals into leadership roles, combining expertise with fresh energy. Diaspora scholars and technical advisors were brought in to guide reconstruction. Still, for every reform, there was a question. Would these changes take root or wither under political pressure? And then there were the unintended consequences. Projects delayed for years now moved swiftly, sometimes too quickly, leaving gaps in planning and coordination. Officials who had been sidelined reacted cautiously, fearing missteps under scrutiny. Citizens celebrated victories but also feared backlash, realizing that systemic reform was a delicate balancing act. Each ministry became a microcosm of the national struggle, a test of whether transparency, competence, and accountability could survive in the real world. The nation, while inspired, also grew impatient. Questions spread beyond borders. How many ministries in neighboring countries hid similar deceit? How deep did the networks of unqualified officials reach? Captain Traoré's actions had ignited a conversation that could no longer be contained within Burkina Faso. It was becoming clear that this was not just a domestic issue. It was the opening act in a regional reckoning with hidden corruption. The nation held its breath. The 21 officials had been dismissed. But action alone was not enough. Captain Ibrahim Traoré knew that trust, once broken, could not be rebuilt with gestures. It required visible, uncompromising justice. Within hours, assets were frozen, luxury cars, hidden bank accounts, and high-end properties were traced and secured. Every public announcement underscored one message: no more shadows, no more whispers, no tolerance for deception. At the heart of government, transparency became the weapon. Names were read aloud, offices vacated, documents cross-checked and verified for public record. Citizens, for the first time, saw accountability not as a distant promise, but as an unfolding reality. "We are watching," thought a civil servant in the Ministry of Health, staring at the emptied office of a former director. "We are all being held to the same standard." The psychological impact reverberated far beyond Ouagadougou, into rural towns and cities across the country. For ordinary citizens, the purge carried double meaning. Anger surged at the audacity of betrayal. Children denied education, hospitals mismanaged, infrastructure projects delayed. Yet relief followed, relief that justice had a face, that deceit could no longer be hidden. Young graduates, long discouraged, felt a surge of vindication. "Finally," said a student from Bobo Dioulasso, "someone is counting merit, not connections." In classrooms, cafes, and markets, conversations about integrity and competence replaced gossip and cynicism. Traoré's approach was methodical. Each dismissal was paired with formal charges under anti-corruption statutes. Investigators worked around the clock, auditing every ministry, reviewing procurement processes, and tracing fraudulent contracts. No shortcut was overlooked. No loophole left unexamined. The nation witnessed a government not hiding from its failures, but confronting them head-on, with courage and precision. Yet the purge also exposed systemic vulnerabilities, verification procedures, once reliant on self-declared credentials, were now recognized as dangerously inadequate. Human resources officers, often underpaid and politically pressured, had been susceptible to bribery and influence. The realization shocked citizens. What had seemed like isolated incidents were symptoms of a far larger, entrenched problem. And Traoré knew that removing 21 officials, though dramatic, was merely the beginning. The emotional weight of justice was immense. Families of honest students, women long excluded from leadership opportunities, rural communities denied basic services, all felt a shift in the wind. Hope returned, subtle but unmistakable. Citizens began to imagine a government led by skill and integrity, a system where effort and knowledge mattered more than money or connections. The psychological revolution was underway, and Traoré's unwavering stance was the spark. Yet not everyone welcomed the change. Political allies whispered about potential backlash. International observers monitored each move cautiously, weighing stability against reform. Entrenched elites began to calculate how to adapt, how to preserve privilege in a world suddenly hostile to deceit. The purge had disrupted the status quo, and the ripple effects threatened to destabilize more than just a few offices. Amidst the turmoil, the young civil servants promoted into leadership roles became symbols of a new era, armed with legitimate qualifications and fresh determination. They brought expertise and energy to ministries that had long languished under incompetent management. Diaspora experts, invited to advise and collaborate, reinforced the message. Burkina Faso was serious about competence, and the world was watching. The public watched the unfolding drama with fascination and a growing sense of empowerment. Social media campaigns amplified every victory and every revelation. Citizens engaged in debates, sharing insights and holding officials accountable in real time. The purge was no longer just a scandal. It had become a civic movement, a rallying point for those who had long been marginalized by a system favoring deception over merit. And yet, the shadow remained. While 21 officials had fallen, countless others lurked in obscurity, their influence subtle but potent. Networks of deceit, regional brokers, and hidden alliances posed ongoing threats. Traoré understood. The battle was far from over. The purge had been swift, but the war for lasting integrity required vigilance, strategy, and relentless enforcement. The purge had struck with thunder, yet the question lingered. If corruption had reached so high, and networks stretched beyond national borders, who would confront the next wave? And could the spark of integrity survive the looming storms of resistance? For years, ordinary citizens had watched opportunities slip through their fingers. Graduates who had toiled in classrooms, late nights spent studying, exams passed with sweat and sacrifice. All had been sidelined by those who bought their way into positions of power. The purge of 21 officials was more than a political statement. It was a mirror held up to every family, every young person who had been denied what was rightfully theirs. In Bobo-Dioulasso, a young woman named Awa sat on the steps of her university, staring at a letter that had once promised her a civil service position. It now seemed like a cruel joke. Her post had gone to someone with forged credentials, someone who had never stepped inside a classroom to earn the knowledge they claimed. She clenched her fists. The purge, she realized, was not just justice. It was a vindication. Her struggle, and the struggle of countless others like her, was finally acknowledged. The impact was particularly acute for women and rural students, who had historically faced structural barriers in villages far from city centers. Students who were the first in their families to pursue higher education had often competed not against peers, but against money and connections. When imposters ascended to influential positions, the gap widened further, leaving talent trapped in obscurity. Captain Traoré's actions began to reverse this tide, offering not just hope, but a tangible path forward. Stories emerged across the country. Teachers who had been passed over for promotions finally saw recognition. Engineers who had designed bridges without credit watched projects overseen by fraudsters exposed. Nurses who had studied medicine rigorously found relief as hospital management underwent scrutiny. Each revelation was both painful and empowering, a reminder of what had been lost and what could now be reclaimed. At the national level, analysts began to quantify the human cost. Mismanaged projects, failed educational programs, and misallocated resources had delayed development for millions. For each forged diploma, a capable mind had been blocked. Communities had suffered, not as a result of chance, but because systems rewarded deception. The purge made citizens painfully aware of the stakes. Corruption at the top trickled down, shaping the daily lives of ordinary people in ways both visible and invisible. Yet within this reckoning lay hope. The promotion of qualified young civil servants, combined with the involvement of diaspora experts, began to reshape public perception. Citizens witnessed that merit and integrity could be rewarded. That effort mattered, and that opportunity could once again be earned. Awa, like many others, began to imagine herself in a future where her skills and dedication would be recognized, where leadership would reflect competence rather than privilege. Social media amplified these narratives. Young Africans shared stories of exclusion, perseverance, and eventual vindication. Hashtags such as merit matters and justice served spread rapidly, capturing the imagination of students from Lagos to Johannesburg. The purge had transcended political drama. It became a moral lesson, a cultural awakening. For once, integrity was not an abstract ideal, but a measurable, observable force, reshaping society. But the transformation was not painless. Families confronted the realities of long-term exclusion. Questions emerged. How many lives had been altered irreparably? How many careers destroyed? The emotional weight was heavy, even as the nation celebrated progress. In classrooms, homes, and villages, the purge sparked conversations that had never been possible before. Debates about fairness, accountability, and the responsibility of citizens to demand transparency. Captain Traoré's reforms began to address systemic inequities, scholarships, mentorship programs, and public sector opportunities were increasingly allocated based on verified merit. Young women and rural students, once marginalized, now found doors opening. National service programs allowed volunteers to contribute to infrastructure, education, and healthcare, instilling a sense of civic duty and community pride. The human cost was being acknowledged, and corrective measures implemented with urgency and purpose. Yet the deeper question lingered, unspoken but omnipresent. If 21 officials could manipulate the system so profoundly, how many more opportunities had been stolen in silence, unseen by public eyes? Could meritocracy survive in a system still vulnerable to deceit? Or would these reforms be temporary, overridden by entrenched interests and hidden networks? For every life reclaimed, countless others remained at risk. As the nation celebrated justice, the shadows of unexposed corruption loomed large, and the next battle for fairness, integrity, and human dignity had only just begun. The purge of 21 officials had sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso, but Captain Ibrahim Traoré knew that justice alone would not rebuild a nation. Removing imposters was only the first step. To restore competence, credibility, and hope, he needed a structural overhaul, an emergency reform that would touch every ministry, every project, and every citizen's perception of governance. The first move was bold and symbolic. A wave of young, qualified civil servants were promoted into leadership positions. Many were barely in their 30s, yet their expertise and proven merit spoke louder than age. Engineers who had labored in obscurity, doctors with years of clinical experience, administrators with flawless records, all were now entrusted with the responsibility that had once been stolen. Across ministries, the infusion of young blood energized stagnant offices and signaled a new era. Traoré also turned to the diaspora. Scholars, engineers, and medical professionals working in Paris, Montreal, Boston, Berlin, and Dakar received direct invitations to return, collaborate, and advise. Some accepted immediately, bringing expertise that had long been absent from the corridors of power. Their arrival was more than symbolic. It demonstrated that Burkina Faso valued knowledge over connections, skill over deceit. The public saw their government actively reclaiming the nation's intellectual capital. Alongside this, partnerships with respected universities in Africa and abroad were established. Institutions in South Africa and Morocco began auditing civil service credentials, while agreements with European and American universities opened exchange programs for young professionals, it was a clear message. Shortcuts would no longer determine leadership. Verified knowledge would shape the state. The effects were swift and visible. Projects that had stalled for years suddenly met deadlines. Roads worth millions were completed. Saving government funds, health and education budgets were now tracked with precision, cutting waste and redirecting resources where they mattered most. Citizens began to feel the tangible benefits of a system run by competence rather than deception. The reform was no longer theoretical, it was transforming daily life. Yet the process was not without resistance. Veteran officials, accustomed to power through connections, murmured about the dangers of rapid change. Some feared losing influence, others worried that inexperienced youth would stumble under pressure. Traoré anticipated these challenges, pairing young leaders with mentors, creating cross-functional teams to support decision-making. Mistakes would be corrected swiftly, but the principle remained unchanged. Competence first, privilege last. The public responded with cautious optimism. Citizens who had long felt powerless now witnessed their government embracing transparency, skill, and integrity. Students shared stories of inspiration online. Teachers regained hope that merit would matter, and young women in rural areas saw previously blocked pathways opening. The reform was creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond policy. It was altering the nation's psychology, redefining what was possible when leadership demanded accountability. International observers noted the shift. Donors and lenders, previously skeptical, now recognized Burkina Faso as a nation serious about reform. Interest rates on government bonds began to drop, signaling confidence in fiscal responsibility. Foreign governments and institutions were reassured that resources would be managed by capable hands. The reform was not only strengthening the nation internally, but improving its credibility globally. Yet Traoré remained vigilant. He knew that the shadow of deception still lingered. Networks of fraudulent credentials had regional connections, and unqualified officials in neighboring countries could influence cross-border projects and policies. Emergency reform within Burkina Faso was necessary, but not sufficient. The systemic roots of corruption required constant monitoring, vigilance, and innovation. Citizens watched as a new rhythm of governance emerged. Accountability, verification, and competence intertwined with everyday administration. Young professionals led meetings, diaspora, experts-guided strategy, and public scrutiny became part of the process. Burkina Faso was no longer a nation where deception could thrive unnoticed. The message was unmistakable. Integrity was mandatory, not optional. The emergency reform had ignited hope and momentum, but question remained. Could these structural changes withstand political pressure? Would entrenched interests adapt, finding new loopholes to exploit? And as the reform spread, could Burkina Faso's model inspire a regional revolution in governance? Or would the shadows of deception strike back before integrity could fully take hold? Within months of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's emergency reforms, the effects became undeniable. Roads that had languished half-built for years were suddenly completed with precision. Bridges that had stalled under mismanagement now stood firm, overseen by verified engineers and competent project managers. The citizens of Burkina Faso, long accustomed to promises broken by incompetence, began to see tangible results. In Ouagadougou, a $120 million road initiative reached completion ahead of schedule. Vehicles moved freely, where potholes had once slowed traffic, and the public could feel the difference immediately. Contractors, previously hampered by oversight from unqualified officials, now reported clear instructions, strict timelines, and accountability. Millions of dollars were saved in penalties and delays. But more importantly, confidence in governance began to return. Health ministries experienced similar breakthroughs. Hospitals and clinics received supplies on schedule. Budgets were meticulously tracked, and staff, with verified qualifications, managed patient care. Nurses who had once struggled under administrators with false credentials could now focus on saving lives rather than navigating bureaucratic chaos. Patients noticed the change. Waiting times shortened. Essential medicines arrived on time, and procedures ran smoothly. For families across the country, these were tangible signs that competence now mattered. Education, too, began to reflect the reform. Teachers were promoted based on verified merit rather than connections. School programs were properly funded, and textbooks reached classrooms without delay. Rural students, often the first in their families to attend school, began to feel hope once again. Students like Awa, sidelined by fraudulent officials for years, now saw that their hard work and dedication could finally open doors. The nation was witnessing a tangible revaluation of merit. Even smaller communities felt the impact. In Bobodioulasso, a new clinic opened with trained medical staff, bringing care to areas long neglected. Farmers in Kaya attending agricultural workshops received proper equipment and guidance, increasing crop yields and stabilizing local economies. These improvements were more than operational, they were symbolic. Citizens recognized that the government now valued expertise, honesty, and public service over deception. Public perception began to shift dramatically. Citizens who had once been cynical and disengaged now followed government announcements closely, observing transparency in action. Social media amplified the narrative. Young graduates shared stories of promotion based on merit. Teacher posted classroom improvements, and parents celebrated children who now had a fair chance at success. Civic engagement surged as discussions of integrity, competence, and accountability filled markets, classrooms, and online forums. International observers took note. Investors and donors adjusted their assessments, confidence returning as reforms showed measurable results. Government bond interest rates dropped slightly, signaling belief in Burkina Faso's fiscal management. Multinational corporations, previously cautious, began renegotiating contracts with newly appointed, capable officials. The early success sent a powerful message. Competence was no longer symbolic. It was actionable, measurable, and effective. Yet challenges remained. Newly promoted officials, despite their qualifications, had to navigate ministries long dominated by networks of influence. Some struggled to adapt to the new transparency measures, while lingering resentment from displaced officials occasionally slowed implementation. Captain Traoré mitigated these risks by pairing young leaders with experienced mentors and enforcing audits rigorously. Mistakes would be corrected swiftly, but the principle remained unchanged. Integrity first, privilege last. Psychologically, the transformation was profound. Citizens began to see that meritocracy was possible, that effort could overcome historical barriers. Students and young professionals now believed their skills could open doors. Women and rural students, previously marginalized, began receiving opportunities they had long been denied. National service programs reinforced civic duty, encouraging youth to participate in community projects, infrastructure, and education, tangible contributions that strengthened both society and trust in governance. Across West Africa, the ripple effects were already visible. Neighboring nations observed Burkina Faso's reforms with interest and a hint of envy. Social movements and student groups debated meritocracy and accountability, inspired by the visible changes. The purge and subsequent reform were no longer local events. They were becoming a blueprint for potential regional transformation in governance standards. Early signs of transformation were promising, but uncertainty loomed. Could these reforms withstand political pressure, entrenched interests, and regional challenges? Would Burkina Faso's model inspire a continental movement, or would old networks adapt, threatening to undo progress before integrity could fully take root? Captain Ibrahim Traoré understood that removing the 21 corrupt officials and promoting young qualified leaders were only the first steps. True reform required creating a system that could prevent deception from ever flourishing again. For decades, Burkina Faso had relied on paper-based processes, opaque approvals, and discretionary bureaucracies, fertile ground for corruption. Traoré's solution was audacious: a full digital transformation of governance, making transparency both visible and mandatory. Every ministry began uploading budgets, contracts, and project records to a centralized digital platform. Auditors, citizens, and journalists gained partial access. Roads, hospitals, and schools could now be monitored in real time. Citizens could check whether a bridge project was on schedule, whether funds for a clinic reached its destination, or whether school programs were delivered as planned. Transparency was no longer optional. It was codified, measurable, and enforceable. Open bidding became mandatory for contracts above $100. Ling ling ling. Monopolies and politically connected contractors were no longer shielded by secrecy. Every tender, every bid, every award was published online. Civil servants attempting to bypass the system faced immediate exposure, legal consequences, and public scrutiny. Multinational firms accustomed to negotiating in private were forced to adapt to a landscape of accountability and visibility. Independent audits were introduced annually, conducted by external African-led firms. Their reports were made public, creating a culture of scrutiny at every level. Ghost employees, inflated contracts, and hidden payments could no longer remain unnoticed. Citizens actively participated, comparing budgets to outcomes, reporting discrepancies, and engaging in civic oversight. Transparency became a tangible force, shaping governance and daily life. Whistleblower protection became a central pillar. Civil servants reporting fraud were guaranteed anonymity and, in some cases, financial rewards. Early whistleblowers exposed mismanaged healthcare funds and phantom construction projects, prompting immediate corrections. Their courage inspired others, reinforcing a culture where truth became a weapon against corruption. Stories of success spread quickly. A young auditor in Bobo Dioulasso, who reported irregularities in school supply contracts, received public recognition, proving that accountability was possible. The psychological impact on citizens was profound. Communities who had long accepted inefficiency and corruption began to see that governance could be competent and fair. Parents monitored school budgets. Students followed hospital supply allocations, and civic organizations debated public contracts. Young professionals shared stories of promotions based on verified merit. For the first time in years, citizens felt empowered. Their vigilance could influence governance, and effort could truly open doors. Economically, the impact was measurable. Analysts estimated that within 6 months, leakage in state spending dropped by nearly 25%. Saving over $50 million. Funds previously siphoned through fraudulent projects were redirected to education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Roads were repaired, clinics stocked, and classrooms equipped. Citizens finally saw that their taxes translated into real, tangible benefits. The nation's GDP, though modest, began to feel the effects of better resource allocation. Schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects became living proof of the reforms. In Ouagadougou, a new clinic opened on schedule, staffed entirely by verified medical personnel. Waiting times shortened, treatments improved, and patient satisfaction soared. Rural students in Kaya received textbooks and laboratory materials that had been delayed for years. Farmers attending workshops on irrigation found that equipment arrived on time, and training programs were properly funded. The benefits were both practical and symbolic. Competence now mattered. International observers also took notice. Donors, lenders, and investors reassessed Burkina Faso. Seeing a country serious about accountability, government bond interest rates dropped, signaling restored confidence. Multinational corporations renegotiated contracts with a new understanding. Oversight and competence were now the currency of negotiation. Burkina Faso's digital transparency blueprint sent a message to the world. Integrity was not a symbolic ideal. It was a practical, enforceable reality. Yet, challenges persisted. Systems could still be circumvented by insiders or political pressure. Displaced elites searched for loopholes. Eager to regain influence, Traoré responded with continuous monitoring, technology upgrades, and strict enforcement. Transparency, he understood, required a culture that embraced it, not just software and procedures. Civic education, social accountability, and public engagement were essential to prevent backsliding. The social and cultural effects were remarkable. Citizens, young and old, began to internalize accountability. Students posted progress of school renovations online. Parents tracked clinic improvements. Community debates about procurement, budgets, and governance flourished. Civic engagement became tangible. Governance was no longer a distant game played by elites. It was a shared responsibility. one in which ordinary citizens could participate and hold leaders accountable. Despite early success, the shadow of risk remained. Could these systems withstand political pressure, technological sabotage, or entrenched networks seeking new ways to manipulate the system? Could citizens sustain vigilance, or would complacency allow corruption to creep back into ministries and offices? The blueprint had illuminated deception, empowered citizens, and begun to restore faith in governance. But the real test of durability was still ahead. Digital transparency had become a force for accountability, yet shadows lingered. As new loopholes emerged and entrenched interests adapted, who would defend the reforms, and could Burkina Faso ensure that integrity became permanent, rather than a fleeting victory? The nation and the continent waited for the answer. The impact of Burkina Faso's reforms extended far beyond its borders. What began as a national purge and digital overhaul quickly became a regional mirror, reflecting the hidden networks of corruption across West Africa. Governments in Nigeria, Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and Senegal could no longer ignore the revelations. Citizens, students, and civil servants across the region began asking the same question. If Burkina Faso could confront deceit so openly, why couldn't we? In Abuja, Nigeria's Ministry of Education launched an unprecedented review of civil service credentials. Tens of thousands of files were flagged for verification, and early audits revealed widespread anomalies. Ghana, long considered a model of higher education, admitted that diploma mills had undermined its international reputation. Task forces were established, and universities began collaborating to audit graduates' credentials. Inspired directly by Burkina Faso's example, across West Africa, the domino effect continued. Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal saw municipal leaders resign after investigative journalists revealed suspicious degrees. Civil society organizations amplified calls for transparency. Youth groups demanded public audits and stricter verification processes. For the first time in decades, ordinary citizens recognized that systemic corruption was not inevitable. It could be challenged, exposed, and corrected. Regional bodies also took notice. ECOWAS convened an extraordinary session in Accra, debating the creation of a shared accreditation system, a cross-border database to validate university degrees. Ministers discussed how standardization could prevent fraudulent qualifications from undermining governance. The African Union in Addis Ababa took the conversation further, exploring continental frameworks for harmonized higher education standards. Integrity, long fragmented by weak oversight, now became a topic of regional strategy. Social media amplified this momentum. Hashtags like #NoFakeDiplomas and African Excellence surged across platforms. TikTok videos showed students burning mock certificates, while universities hosted debates inspired by the Traoré model. One viral clip of a Ghanaian law student declaring, "We will not be ruled by lies," amassed millions of views within days. Young Africans, long resigned to systemic corruption, suddenly felt a collective sense of agency. Their voices, amplified digitally, were reshaping political pressure and public expectation. Yet the regional domino effect was not universally welcomed. Political elites in some countries whispered warnings of destabilization. Critics labeled the push for transparency as dangerous, arguing that exposing networks could undermine fragile bureaucracies. Some regional leaders worried about the optics of public scrutiny and feared mass resignations or unrest. Despite these warnings, momentum continued. Fueled by citizens demanding reform and accountability, Burkina Faso became a case study. Scholars, journalists, and policymakers across the region analyzed the reform's early successes: digital transparency, meritocratic promotions, whistleblower protection, and independent audits. Other nations began replicating similar systems, adapting elements to local contexts. But the question remained, could these reforms survive political inertia and entrenched interests that had long relied on secrecy and patronage? The social dimension of the domino effect was equally profound. Youth movements, student associations, and civic organizations began coordinating across borders. Regional conferences highlighted best practices, shared investigative findings, and promoted collaborative approaches to governance. Ordinary citizens, empowered by digital tools, began monitoring their governments, tracking projects, and challenging fraudulent appointments. The spark that Traoré ignited in Burkina Faso was spreading, transforming civic engagement into a regional phenomenon. Economic implications were also significant. As governments implemented stricter verification systems, multinational investors took note. Contracts and negotiations were now subject to scrutiny, not only within national borders but also regionally. The ripple effect had the potential to redirect billions annually into legitimate development projects, funding infrastructure, education, and healthcare more effectively than ever before. For the first time, the public, private, and civil sectors began envisioning a West Africa where competence and integrity could drive sustainable growth. Yet uncertainty lingered. While the domino effect inspired reforms, it also exposed vulnerabilities. Networks of fake diplomas, brokers, and insiders began to adapt, creating more sophisticated methods to bypass verification systems. The shadow of deception loomed, suggesting that regional reform would require constant vigilance. Burkina Faso's model was a spark, but sustaining a continent-wide transformation demanded resilience, enforcement, and cultural change. Citizens, young professionals, and activists understood the stakes. They saw a moment in history, a region confronting decades of entrenched corruption, demanding transparency, and reclaiming integrity. The dominoes were falling, but the final arrangement, a West Africa truly governed by merit and accountability, remained uncertain. The regional domino effect had begun, illuminating corruption and inspiring reform across borders. Yet hidden networks were adapting. Could these emerging systems withstand pressure, manipulation, and resistance? Would West Africa seize this historic opportunity, or would old structures reassert themselves before transparency could take root? The answer would determine the future of governance across the continent. The ripple effect of Burkina Faso's reforms did not stop at ministries or regional capitals. It surged through the digital world, carried on the fast currents of social media. For the first time, young Africans across West Africa in Lagos, Accra, Bamako, and Johannesburg felt the pulse of empowerment. Screens lit up with hashtags like "No Fake Diplomas," "African Excellence," and "Merit Matters," spreading awareness at unprecedented speed. What had started as a political purge became a digital movement, connecting millions who had long felt powerless. TikTok videos, Instagram reels, and Twitter threads documented acts of civic defiance. Students burning mock diplomas, community members exposing local corruption, and young professionals celebrating promotions based on verified merit. One viral clip showed a Ghanaian law student declaring, "We will not be ruled by lies," garnering over 3 million views in less than a week. Each share amplified the message. Accountability was not a local concern, it was a continental demand. Youth-led organizations took the momentum offline as well. In Accra and Lagos, students organized debates, workshops, and community forums discussing governance, ethics, and public service. Universities hosted panels titled "The Traoré Model" to examine how Burkina Faso's digital reforms could be adapted locally. Across West Africa, young activists and professionals began coordinating campaigns to audit government contracts, track educational credentials, and pressure officials to uphold integrity. The impact of these digital movements extended beyond advocacy. Civic engagement became measurable and actionable. Volunteers formed networks to report discrepancies in public spending, monitor local projects, and hold elected officials accountable. Ordinary citizens, inspired by the example of Burkina Faso, realized that collective action could influence policy decisions. For the first time, young Africans recognized that they were not passive observers. They could actively shape governance outcomes. The psychological effects were profound. Millennials and Gen Z, often frustrated by systemic corruption and economic stagnation, now felt hope and agency. Graduates who had faced exclusion due to fraudulently credentialed officials saw a new path forward. Women, historically marginalized in both politics and the workforce, embraced these platforms to demand representation and fairness. Social media had transformed into a powerful amplifier of civic responsibility, bridging gaps between urban centers and rural communities. Stories of individual courage inspired others. A young civil servant in Burkina Faso reported misallocation of school funds through an online portal and received public acknowledgement and financial reward. In Senegal, a student group exposed irregularities in municipal contracts, prompting a local investigation. These examples demonstrated that digital tools, combined with vigilance and integrity, could translate online activism into tangible social impact. International observers began to note the power of this youth-led digital surge. NGOs and development agencies tracked engagement metrics and concluded that grassroots advocacy, empowered by social media, could serve as a complement to formal reforms. For the first time, public sentiment became a quantifiable influence. En gouvernance décision, bridging the gap between citizens and institutions. Yet this newfound power was not without risk. Governments unaccustomed to transparency felt pressure and pushed back in subtle ways. Critics warned that online campaigns could be manipulated, turning genuine accountability into performative activism. Social media, while powerful, was also volatile. Narratives could be distorted, movements co-opted, or momentum stalled by disinformation. Young activists had to navigate these challenges while sustaining focus on systemic change. The movement also sparked cultural shifts. Students began discussing ethics, leadership, and civic duty in ways never seen before. Parents encouraged children to engage in civic projects, emphasizing responsibility over opportunism. Community service became a point of pride, not obligation. For the first time, integrity and meritocracy were celebrated culturally, not merely legislatively. Despite progress, the question lingered: could digital activism sustain the reforms initiated by governments? Could the momentum of youth movements translate into long-term systemic change? Or would entrenched interests find ways to counteract transparency and accountability? These were not hypothetical concerns. The shadow networks exposed in Burkina Faso and across West Africa remained adaptable and vigilant. The surge of social media activism and youth engagement had transformed public consciousness, but could these movements endure against political pressure, disinformation, and entrenched corruption? Would the collective energy of young Africans be enough to turn sparks into lasting reform? Or would the forces of the old system find new ways to resist? The future of governance across the region hung in balance, waiting for the next decisive moment. The wave of reform in Burkina Faso did not go unnoticed by its diaspora. For years, talented scholars, engineers, doctors, and economists had left the country, seeking education and careers abroad, their skills diverted to foreign economies. But now, the purge and emergency reforms sent a powerful signal. Expertise mattered. Integrity mattered, and the nation was ready to reward merit. In Paris, Montreal, and Boston, academics received invitations to collaborate with Burkina Faso's government. Engineers in Berlin, medical researchers in Dakar, and economists in London were encouraged to return or contribute remotely to development projects. The message was clear: knowledge, verified and earned, would shape the nation's future. Within 6 months, dozens responded, bringing skills, experience, and a renewed sense of purpose. Their arrival was transformative. Ministries benefited from international best practices, project management skills, and technical expertise previously absent. Infrastructure projects, previously delayed, now followed international standards for efficiency and safety. Health programs were revamped, with diaspora doctors advising on hospital administration and clinical training. Economic policy, informed by returning experts, emphasized fiscal responsibility, transparency, and sustainable development. Beyond technical contributions, the psychological impact was profound. Citizens witnessed a nation valuing merit over connections. Schil over deception. Students and young professionals began to believe that effort and education could open doors. The diaspora's return sent a powerful cultural message. Success abroad could be leveraged for domestic progress, and national service was both honorable and impactful. Communities felt the effects directly. Rural schools received new resources, supported by diaspora-led programs. Hospitals in smaller towns gained access to modern management techniques and equipment. Local businesses benefited from improved infrastructure, and citizens noted tangible improvements in their daily lives. The return of diaspora talent was not abstract. It was measurable, immediate, and visible. Economically, the impact was significant. Analysts estimated that the return of skilled professionals added nearly $85 million annually in human capital value. This brain gain complemented ongoing reforms, increasing efficiency in ministries, improving public services, and accelerating development projects. Investors and international partners noticed the change, leading to improved credit ratings and renewed confidence in Burkina Faso's governance. Yet the return of the diaspora also presented challenges. Integrating returning professionals required careful planning to prevent friction with existing staff. Some civil servants, accustomed to older hierarchies, resisted the influx of new ideas and modern practices. Traoré's administration managed this by pairing diaspora experts with young, verified civil servants, fostering mentorship and collaboration rather than competition. These cross-generational teams became symbols of a new governance model, meritocratic, accountable, and inclusive. The cultural ramifications were equally significant. Students, inspired by the visible return of national talent, began to see education as a pathway to meaningful contribution. Women and marginalized groups, previously blocked by systemic barriers, now saw opportunities to participate in governance, healthcare, and education. Civic engagement increased as youth understood that their skills and knowledge could influence policy and societal outcomes. This phenomenon sparked conversations across the continent. Neighboring countries observed Burkina Faso's success with interest, noting that leveraging diaspora talent could accelerate national development and strengthen governance. Social media amplified these stories. Graduates shared experiences of collaboration, mentorship, and tangible contributions to public service. The narrative of brain drain was reversing, replaced by a story of brain gain. Yet, even with these successes, questions remained. Could the momentum last? Would returning experts be able to navigate political pressures, entrenched interests, and bureaucratic inertia? And could the diaspora's influence be scaled to regional impact, inspiring similar transformations across West Africa? Traoré understood that the initial return of talent was only the beginning. Sustaining this influx required continual reform, transparent incentives, and opportunities for meaningful contribution. The human dimension of the diaspora's return was deeply emotional. Families who had long seen their children leave, often never to return, now witnessed tangible evidence that education and skill could serve the nation. For young graduates, the psychological shift was profound. Merit mattered, honesty was rewarded, and competence could now shape policy, infrastructure, and healthcare. National pride, long eroded by systemic corruption, began to resurface. The return of diaspora talent and the resulting brain gain had ignited a new era of competence and hope. Yet uncertainty lingered. Could these gains withstand political interference, resistance from entrenched elites, and regional challenges? Could Burkina Faso's success inspire a West African renaissance in governance? Or would systemic corruption adapt to the new environment, threatening to reverse the progress before it could solidify? The stakes for the continent's future were immense. The return of diaspora talent and the infusion of young, qualified civil servants marked a turning point in Burkina Faso's governance. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré understood that structural reform alone could not reshape the culture of opportunity. Meritocracy had to be redefined, institutionalized, and celebrated across society. This was a battle for hearts and minds as much as for offices and budgets. For decades, leadership positions had been determined by connections, wealth, or political patronage. Women, rural students, and marginalized communities were systematically excluded. The purge and subsequent reforms had disrupted these patterns, but restoring fairness required deliberate strategies. Scholarships, promotions, and public sector roles were now allocated based on verified qualifications and performance. Transparent criteria were published online, ensuring that merit could be recognized by all. The young woman from Bobo Dioulasso, who had once been denied a civil service position, now found herself promoted to a regional administrative role. Her peers, equally qualified, witnessed a system where effort and skill finally mattered. For her, the promotion was more than a career milestone. It was a validation of years of dedication and struggle. Stories like hers spread across communities, inspiring youth and signaling that the nation was serious about rewriting opportunity. National service programs were also expanded. Tens of thousands of young men and women volunteered to serve their communities for a year, participating in infrastructure projects, health initiatives, and educational outreach. This program was not merely symbolic. It became a civic ritual, teaching responsibility, collaboration, and national pride. Students from rural villages now saw themselves as active contributors to nation building, their work visible, valued, and celebrated. The psychological shift was profound. Citizens began to believe that leadership could no longer be purchased, only earned. Merit, integrity, and competence became the new currency. Social media amplified these changes, as graduates and young professionals shared their experiences of fair competition and recognition. The narrative of exclusion, long ingrained in the national consciousness, began to give way to hope and determination. Women, historically underrepresented in politics and administration, saw doors open for them. Leadership training programs, mentorships with diaspora experts, and targeted scholarships ensured that women could now compete on equal footing. Rural students, once marginalized by geography and resources, were provided stipends, transport, and educational support to compete fairly. Meritocracy was not a theory. It was measurable, practical, and operational. The broader impact was noticeable in public services. Hospitals managed by competent directors saw improvements in patient care and efficiency. Schools administered by verified educators demonstrated higher attendance, better outcomes, and community engagement. Infrastructure projects were completed on time and within budget. Each success reinforced the perception that competence, rather than patronage, now guided the nation's decisions. The movement also reached the private sector. Companies began hiring graduates based on verified qualifications and skill assessments, rather than family connections or political ties. Young professionals, inspired by the government's reforms, demanded accountability from employers as well as public institutions. A culture of meritocracy began permeating urban centers, rural towns, and digital spaces alike. Yet challenges persisted. Entrenched elites, accustomed to systems favoring influence over ability, occasionally resisted change. Political pressure, bureaucratic inertia, and cultural skepticism could slow implementation. Captain Traoré addressed these risks through mentorship programs, pairing experienced leaders with young professionals, and maintaining continuous oversight. Mistakes were corrected swiftly, but the principle was unwavering. Merit first, privilege last. International partners recognized the innovation. Development agencies, universities, and investors praised Burkina Faso as a model for meritocratic governance. Training programs, leadership exchanges, and collaborative projects highlighted how transparent and performance-based systems could strengthen national institutions. The nation's credibility improved, not just in the eyes of its citizens, but globally. The social and psychological dimensions were equally important. Communities began to expect fairness and transparency, demanding accountability from local officials. Students in remote villages tracked educational programs, families monitored infrastructure projects, and young professionals engaged in civic forums to evaluate public services. Meritocracy had become a shared social expectation, shaping behaviors, attitudes, and aspirations. The rewriting of meritocracy had sparked hope, opportunity, and engagement across the nation. Yet question remained: could these principles withstand political pressures and regional influences? Would entrenched elites adapt to preserve old privileges, or could Burkina Faso fully embed a culture where competence and integrity determined every opportunity? The nation, and perhaps the continent, awaited the answer. The reforms in Burkina Faso were not only transforming governance at home, they were reshaping the country's economic landscape and signaling a shift to the international community. Investors, lenders, and development agencies had long viewed the nation as high risk, plagued by inefficiency, corruption, and unqualified leadership. The purge, digital transparency measures, and merit-based promotions challenged these assumptions. Suddenly, Burkina Faso was a case study in rapid, accountable reform. Economists noted immediate effects. Infrastructure projects, previously delayed for years, were now completed on schedule, reducing wasted funds and improving national productivity. Health and education services, overseen by verified professionals, operated efficiently, cutting mismanagement costs. Analysts estimated that reform measures, including digital tracking of expenditures and whistleblower protections, saved the government over $50 million within 6 months. For a country with a GDP of just $20 billion, these savings were transformational. The international community began to respond. Lenders adjusted their risk assessments, reflected in lower interest rates on government bonds. Multinational corporations, once hesitant to invest, saw credible systems of accountability and oversight. Contracts were now governed by verified processes, not political connections. Investors could trust that funds would be used as intended, and project outcomes were measurable. Confidence, long absent, was slowly returning, but the implications went further than finance. Global perception of Burkina Faso shifted. The country was no longer seen merely as a fragile state in need of oversight, but as a model for reform and competence. International media highlighted the transparency measures and meritocratic appointments. Academic conferences studied the Traoré model, and development agencies considered replicating similar frameworks in other fragile states. Burkina Faso was demonstrating that good governance could be locally designed and executed effectively. Internally, economic changes were tangible. Schools received funding on schedule, clinics operated efficiently, and infrastructure projects created jobs. Rural communities, long excluded from national economic planning, felt immediate benefits. Farmers received irrigation projects on time, roads allowed better access to markets, and educational initiatives provided new training opportunities. The economy, once constrained by mismanagement, began to reflect the latent potential of its human capital. Entrepreneurs, inspired by improved governance, started small businesses, confident that contracts, loans, and permits would be administered fairly. Diaspora professionals returning home participated in startups, consultancy, and public-private partnerships. The combination of meritocratic governance and reliable oversight created an ecosystem where innovation and investment were rewarded, not obstructed by corruption. Yet with these opportunities came challenges. Entrenched interests, aware of their diminishing influence, began seeking alternative avenues to reclaim power. Political pressure, subtle manipulation, and attempts to exploit loopholes emerged. Traoré understood that economic transformation was deeply intertwined with political resilience. Systems could fail if oversight weakened, and the nation's hard-won credibility could be compromised. Global actors noticed the stakes. Foreign governments recalculated their diplomatic and trade strategies, acknowledging a Burkina Faso that was increasingly competent and independent. Conditional aid tied to opaque agreements lost leverage. Multinational corporations had to renegotiate contracts transparently. In plain terms, the traditional levers of influence were shrinking, replaced by a nation, asserting its own terms based on competence and integrity. For ordinary citizens, the economic impact was also personal. Families saw clinics functioning properly, schools delivering resources, and roads completed on time. Jobs were created in infrastructure and public services, providing income and stability. Students gained confidence that effort and skill could translate into real opportunity. The nation's GDP, while modest, began to reflect a more efficient allocation of human and financial resources. Yet, uncertainty persisted. Could these reforms withstand external pressures, regional instability, or the resurgence of corruption through adaptive networks? International observers were optimistic but cautious. The success of Burkina Faso could inspire neighboring states to follow suit, but systemic reform required constant vigilance. One misstep, one failure in transparency could reverse decades of progress. Economic transformation and restored global confidence had brought hope and opportunity, yet lurking threats remained: entrenched elites, regional instability, and adaptive corruption networks. Could Burkina Faso maintain momentum, sustain trust, and ensure that integrity remained the foundation of growth, or would external and internal pressures undermine the fragile gains, leaving the nation at a crossroads once more? For every victory, there were forces unwilling to accept change. The dramatic purge, the digital transparency blueprint, and the merit-based promotions disrupted entrenched networks that had long thrived on secrecy and favoritism. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's reforms had broken old hierarchies, and many elites quietly, then not so quietly, began plotting resistance. Inside the ministries, murmurs of dissent spread. Senior officials who had previously wielded influence through patronage feared loss of authority and privileges. They whispered about destabilization, warning that rapid reform could disrupt bureaucratic efficiency. Some attempted subtle obstruction, slowing the approval of projects, questioning new hires, or exploiting bureaucratic loopholes to delay enforcement. For the first time, their tactics were visible, their networks exposed, and Traoré's administration responded with vigilance. Beyond the bureaucracies, political actors sought to challenge the reforms. Opposition parties framed the purge as a political maneuver, alleging that it was selective and aimed at consolidating power. Media outlets, some aligned with former elites, published articles questioning the legality and fairness of the rapid dismissals and digital reforms. The narrative they sought to craft was one of instability, warning citizens that the pursuit of meritocracy might destabilize governance and the economy. Despite these pressures, Traoré maintained a dual strategy: enforcement, coupled with transparency. Every act of resistance was documented, reported, and made visible to the public. Ministries were audited in real time. Digital platforms tracked every approval and expenditure, and whistleblowers were encouraged to expose obstruction and manipulation. The message was clear: resistance could no longer operate in the shadows. Accountability was now public, immediate, and enforceable. Civil society and the youth became critical allies. Social media amplified cases of obstruction, from delayed projects to mismanaged procurement. Citizens posted videos, screenshots, and analyses highlighting inefficiencies caused by resistance. In urban centers like Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, student organizations and civic groups organized debates and forums, pressuring local governments to comply with national reforms. Young professionals shared examples of success, proving that meritocracy could overcome entrenched interests. Internationally, foreign observers watched closely. Donors and investors monitored the political pushback, assessing whether reforms could be sustained. While impressed by the initial impact of Burkina Faso's transparency measures, they recognized that adaptive networks could reassert influence if reforms were not reinforced. Development agencies provided guidance and funding for capacity building, helping ministries implement checks and balances, ensuring that meritocracy would not be reversed. Resistance also manifested economically. Some contractors, long accustomed to preferential treatment, attempted to subvert the open bidding system. Lobbying, subtle delays, and threats emerged in the private sector. Multinational companies faced pressure to bypass new protocols, but oversight and public scrutiny limited their options. The environment had shifted. Transparency now carried consequences, and every attempt to undermine it was observable and reportable. The psychological toll was real. Citizens, civil servants, and young professionals were tested daily. Disillusionment threatened when progress was slowed by obstruction. Yet, the visible success of projects, the return of diaspora talent, and the measurable improvements in public services reinforced belief. Momentum, though challenged, remained. The cultural shift toward meritocracy and integrity persisted because the reforms had been embedded deeply in both governance structures and social consciousness. Women and marginalized groups, historically excluded from power, played a critical role in sustaining reforms. Female civil servants and community leaders became vocal advocates, ensuring that opportunities created through meritocracy were not reversed. rural communities, empowered by access to transparent information and direct involvement in monitoring projects, resisted attempts by local elites to restore old hierarchies. Across society, resistance encountered accountability at every turn. Yet the battle was far from over. Traoré recognized that adaptive forces could regroup, exploit weakness, and reassert influence if vigilance waned. Political pushback, social unrest, and attempts to manipulate digital systems all remained constant threats. Sustaining reform required not only enforcement, but cultural reinforcement, ensuring that citizens, youth movements, and civil society remained engaged and empowered. Resistance had emerged from every corner. Bureaucracies, political elites, private interests. Yet the momentum of reform persisted. The question loomed: could Burkina Faso withstand these adaptive pressures, secure lasting meritocracy, and inspire regional transformation, or would entrenched interests find new ways to reclaim power before the nation fully consolidated its gains? The next battle would determine the durability of change. After months of reform and public scrutiny, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's administration entered a phase of consolidation. The purge, digital transformation, merit-based promotions, and diaspora return had shaken Burkina Faso. But sustainability required deliberate, enforceable measures. Momentum alone could not secure change. The systems themselves had to be reinforced. The first step was legal codification. Policies that had been implemented by executive order were now enshrined in law. Verification of credentials became mandatory for all civil servants, with independent audits scheduled regularly. Digital platforms for procurement, budgeting, and project tracking were integrated into statutory frameworks, ensuring continuity even amidst political shifts. This codification created legal barriers against rollback attempts, making reform harder to reverse. Next, institutional capacity was strengthened. Ministries were reorganized to embed meritocracy into hiring, promotion, and evaluation processes. Departments dedicated to monitoring and evaluation were staffed with both young, qualified professionals and returning diaspora experts. Training programs emphasized transparency, ethics, and accountability, embedding these values into the daily operations of government. Civil servants learned that competence and honesty were not temporary priorities but core institutional expectations. Community engagement was equally prioritized. Citizens were encouraged to participate in monitoring local projects, reporting irregularities, and holding officials accountable. Feedback mechanisms were formalized, with public reporting on infrastructure, healthcare, and educational initiatives. National service programs continued, emphasizing civic responsibility, skill building, and collaboration between youth and local administrations. The population became active stakeholders in governance, ensuring that transparency extended beyond ministry walls. Economic measures reinforced these social and institutional reforms. Open bidding, digital oversight, and whistleblower protections were strictly maintained. Contracts were awarded based on merit. Timelines were monitored digitally, and mismanagement was quickly identified and corrected. Savings from reduced waste were redirected to schools, clinics, and infrastructure, producing tangible improvements that citizens could see and feel. Confidence in public service increased, creating a virtuous cycle of accountability and engagement. The diaspora played a critical role in consolidation. Returning professionals continued mentoring civil servants, advising on strategic projects, and guiding capacity-building initiatives. Their expertise provided continuity, bridging the gap between ambitious reforms and practical implementation. Ministries that had previously struggled under unqualified management now operated efficiently, combining domestic talent with global expertise. Political pressures and residual resistance were addressed through transparency and legal enforcement. Public disclosure of project timelines, budgets, and outcomes made obstruction visible. Civil society, social media, and youth movements continued to monitor reforms, creating multiple layers of accountability. Any attempt to subvert meritocracy or digital oversight was rapidly exposed, deterring potential resistance. The results were unmistakable. Infrastructure projects were completed on time and within budget. Hospitals operated efficiently, clinics received necessary supplies, and educational programs reached rural areas previously neglected. Government spending became measurable, waste decreased, and public trust rose. Citizens began to believe that effort, skill, and honesty could open doors in both the public and private sectors. Internationally, Burkina Faso gained recognition as a model of reform and governance. Lenders, investors, and development agencies praised the transparency measures, digital systems, and merit-based appointments. Confidence in the country's economic stability improved, reflected in lower borrowing costs, increased investment, and renewed diplomatic respect. The nation was no longer a passive recipient of foreign aid, but an active architect of its own development. Yet the battle for permanence remained. Traoré understood that systems, however robust, required constant vigilance. Networks of influence, hidden corruption, and adaptive elites were persistent threats. Consolidation measures, legal codification, and social engagement were designed to mitigate these risks. But the nation's success depended on continued enforcement and public participation. Reform was not a one-time victory. It was an ongoing commitment. Burkina Faso had consolidated its reforms, strengthened institutions, and regained public trust. Yet question persisted. Could these measures survive the next political transition? Would entrenched networks attempt resurgence, or had the nation truly embedded meritocracy and transparency as permanent pillars? The outcome would determine not just the country's future, but the potential for regional influence and continental transformation. The aftermath of Burkina Faso's sweeping reforms revealed a landscape transformed yet delicate. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's bold purge, digital transparency initiatives, diaspora engagement, and meritocratic policies had left the nation stronger. But the consequences, both intended and unforeseen, were profound. Every ministry, every project, and every citizen had felt the impact, and the lessons were emerging in real time. Economically, the results were tangible. Infrastructure projects completed on schedule, improved transportation and trade. Hospitals operated efficiently, clinics received timely supplies, and schools delivered resources to rural communities that had been long neglected. Analysts estimated billions saved annually through reduced mismanagement and fraud, funds that were redirected into public services. The GDP, though modest, reflected the cumulative benefits of competence, efficiency, and accountability. Yet the reforms carried human consequences as well. For the first time, ordinary citizens and civil servants experienced meritocracy as reality rather than aspiration. Graduates who had once been sidelined by corrupt officials now found doors opening to positions they had rightfully earned. Women and rural students gained unprecedented opportunities. Stories like Awaz, a young woman from Bobo Dioulasso promoted to regional administration, became emblematic of the nation's shift. These changes restored hope, agency, and dignity to countless lives. The diaspora's role underscored a powerful lesson. Talent, nurtured abroad, could be reintegrated into national development. Scholars, engineers, and medical professionals returning from Europe, North America, and Asia provided technical expertise, mentorship, and capacity building, amplifying domestic efforts. Their contributions validated the principle that human capital, when trusted and empowered, could transform national outcomes rapidly and sustainably. Socially, the reforms fostered a new culture of accountability. Citizens monitored projects online, engaged in community oversight, and participated in national service programs. Young professionals and students embraced civic responsibility as a moral and practical imperative. The cultural shift was subtle, yet profound. Integrity, competence, and merit became societal expectations, no longer abstract ideals. Politically, the consequences were complex. Resistance had not disappeared entirely. Entrenched elites and adaptive networks tested the limits of the new system, probing for loopholes or opportunities to regain influence. Yet the combination of legal codification, digital oversight, and citizen engagement created formidable barriers to regression. Transparency and accountability were now structural, reducing the risk that reforms could be reversed easily. The international community observed the ripple effects closely. Confidence in Burkina Faso's governance increased among lenders, investors, and development agencies. Bonds were issued at lower rates. Contracts were negotiated fairly, and foreign aid became more strategic rather than conditional or manipulative. Burkina Faso had moved from a perceived high-risk state to a model for competence-driven reform in fragile nations. Despite these successes, Traoré understood that the nation was at a crossroads. The lessons were clear. Reforms must be sustained, transparency reinforced, and civic engagement continually nurtured. Systems required vigilance, and culture had to internalize accountability for meritocracy. To endure, citizens had tasted empowerment, and any regression could lead to disillusionment or unrest. Education, healthcare, and infrastructure became living laboratories for these lessons. Monitoring and evaluation mechanisms, combined with citizen feedback, ensured continuous improvement. Mistakes were corrected publicly, successes celebrated widely. Communities were reminded that governance was a shared responsibility, not a privilege reserved for a few. The psychological effect was immense. Young Africans now believed their effort, knowledge, and integrity could shape outcomes. Regional implications also emerged. Neighboring countries, inspired by Burkina Faso's example, initiated similar audits and reforms. Social media movements, student activism, and diaspora collaboration transcended borders, creating a broader consciousness about meritocracy and integrity. The nation's actions had become a catalyst for potential continental transformation, demonstrating that systemic corruption could be confronted effectively. Yet the lessons were not merely practical. They were philosophical. Leadership could no longer be purchased, competence could not be faked, and opportunities could no longer be hoarded by the few. Integrity, skill, and accountability were not optional. They were prerequisites for public service. These principles became guiding stars for a society, rebuilding trust and expectation. Burkina Faso had reclaimed competence, restored trust, and demonstrated the power of meritocracy. But the final question lingered. Could these lessons endure across political transitions, economic pressures, and regional influences? Could the nation maintain its integrity when faced with new challenges? Or would the cycle of corruption and privilege attempt to reassert itself? The answers would emerge in the ultimate chapter of the nation's transformation story. September 4th, 2025, had become a date etched in the nation's memory. The purge of 21 officials, the digital transformation, the return of diaspora, and the establishment of meritocracy had sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso and beyond. Yet the nation had not only survived the upheaval, it had begun to redefine its identity, its governance, and its future. The immediate aftermath revealed a society more resilient, more capable, and more engaged. Infrastructure projects were completed on time, hospitals ran efficiently, clinics received necessary supplies, and schools in remote villages finally delivered programs as intended. Citizens saw tangible results from governance that was competent, transparent, and accountable. This was no longer theory, it was lived reality. Economic gains followed quickly. Digital tracking of funds, open bidding for contracts, and the enforcement of meritocracy reduced leakage and mismanagement. Savings were redirected into public services, creating a virtuous cycle. Infrastructure improved, healthcare expanded, education strengthened. The GDP, modest as it was, reflected an economy benefiting from human capital, now properly recognized and utilized. The return of diaspora talent added expertise and credibility, amplifying these gains across multiple sectors. But the true transformation was social. Citizens, particularly youth, began to feel agency. Students monitored projects, parents tracked school funding, and community members held local leaders accountable. Women and marginalized groups finally saw opportunities for advancement based on skill rather than connections. National service programs instilled civic responsibility, linking the energy of young volunteers to visible, meaningful projects. Meritocracy had become both principle and practice, reshaping expectations for leadership and citizenship. Regional implications were equally profound. Neighboring countries observed Burkina Faso as a living example of reform in action. Governments in Ghana, Nigeria, Côte d'Ivoire, and Senegal initiated their own audits and verification measures. Social media amplified the impact, creating a pan-West African discourse on integrity, competence, and transparency. Burkina Faso's reforms had sparked a domino effect, signaling that long-standing systems of corruption could be confronted effectively. Internationally, the nation's credibility soared. Investors, donors, and lenders now viewed Burkina Faso as competent, predictable, and accountable. Multinational corporations adjusted contracts, and foreign aid became strategic rather than coercive. The country's newfound governance model challenged long-held narratives about African fragility, proving that locally designed reforms could succeed without external imposition. Yet, the greatest triumph was psychological. Citizens, once disillusioned, now believed in the possibility of fair governance. Students saw merit rewarded. Professionals saw competence recognized. And communities realized that transparency could shape their daily lives. A culture of integrity, once abstract, had become tangible, woven into the expectations of society. Hope, long suppressed by years of corruption and incompetence, returned in full force. Captain Ibrahim Traoré understood that this was only the beginning. Systems needed constant vigilance. Networks of influence and corruption could attempt to re-emerge, but the foundations were now stronger. Legal frameworks, digital oversight, citizen engagement, and meritocratic institutions. The nation had learned that reform was an ongoing process, one that required both structures and culture to endure. The educational system reflected these changes profoundly. Graduates like Ewa, who had once been denied opportunity, now led initiatives that impacted entire regions. Women took leadership roles in ministries and civic programs, while rural students gained scholarships and resources that had been unavailable for decades. Human potential, long suppressed, was finally being recognized and cultivated, creating a new generation of empowered citizens. Civic engagement extended beyond national borders. Inspired by Burkina Faso, youth movements across West Africa demanded accountability and transparency in their own nations. Digital activism, combined with local oversight, reinforced the continent-wide belief that meritocracy and integrity were not merely ideals, but achievable standards. The nation had sparked a continental conversation about leadership, honesty, and development. Yet, even in triumph, questions remained. Could these reforms withstand future political transitions? Could the culture of accountability persist amid external pressures, regional instability, or attempts to manipulate systems? The challenge was ongoing, requiring vigilance, civic participation, and continued reinforcement of the principles now enshrined in law and social expectation. Message and reflection. The story of September 4th is not just about the purge of 21 officials or the digital transformation of a government. It is about reclaiming the fundamental principle that leadership is earned, not purchased, that competence matters more than connections, that integrity is the true currency of governance. It is a lesson for every citizen, every student, and every leader. Looking ahead, Burkina Faso stands as a symbol of possibility. Its journey reminds Africa and the world that change is not only achievable, it is sustainable when built on transparency, meritocracy, and civic engagement. The nation's trajectory is a call to action, for citizens to remain vigilant, for leaders to prioritize competence and honesty, and for societies to nurture talent wherever it exists. Climactic call to action. The reforms, the victories, and the hope are not static. They require participation. Every citizen can influence the future by engaging, monitoring, and advocating. Leadership is not merely in the hands of the few, it resides in the collective will of the many. If you believe in verified excellence, if you believe in competence and integrity, your voice matters. Share it. Advocate. Participate. Final reflection. September 4th, 2025, will be remembered as more than a political announcement. It was a declaration. No more tolerance for deceit. No more appointments based on privilege. No more wasted potential. It was the birth of a nation that chooses merit, accountability, and hope over corruption and complacency. The story of Burkina Faso is a story for all of Africa, a lesson in courage, integrity, and the transformative power of collective will. The nation has taken its first historic steps, but the journey is far from over. As young leaders rise, citizens engage, and systems evolve, the question remains, will Africa, inspired by Burkina Faso, seize its potential to govern with competence and integrity, or will old forces find new ways to challenge progress? The future is unwritten, and the continent's next chapter depends on courage, vigilance, and the belief that verified excellence can triumph